In 1129, a church council at Troy wrote a rule book, 71 clauses for a new kind of soldier, fighting men who took monastic vows. Nobody had tried that before. Much of the rule is about war, obedience and property. A surprising amount of it is about dinner. Meat 3 days a week and no more. 2 men to a single bowl, watching each other eat. Bread eaten in silence, while somebody reads scripture over your head. And 1 sentence that stops a modern reader cold. Habitual meat eating, the rule says, causes a hateful corruption of the body. That line gets quoted today as though the Templars had worked something out about the human heart. So why does the same rule put 2 men on watch in case one of them eats too little? Tonight we take the rule's food clauses apart and ask one question. What were they actually for? The answer is not health, and the reason a modern dietitian would still nod at the result is stranger than the myth. If you had asked a Cistercian abbot in 1130 what he made of these men, he would have told you they were an anomaly, and he would have been right. A monk's job was to weaken the flesh. That was not a side effect of the monastic life, it was the point of it. Fasting, silence, hard beds and thin food existed to subdue the body so the soul could get on with its work. The rule of St. Benedict, which sat underneath almost every religious order in Europe, allowed no meat from 4-footed animals at all except for the sick and the very weak. A knight's job was the exact opposite. A mounted man in the 12th century carried a mail hauberk, a helm, a shield, a lance and a sword, and controlled a war horse that would kill him if he lost his grip. That is heavy physical work done in the heat of the Levant, in metal, for hours. Muscle is not optional equipment for that job, it is the equipment, and the training does not stop when the fighting does. Riding in formation, handling remounts, drilling with the lance, wearing the mail long enough that it stops feeling like a punishment. A man loses that conditioning in weeks, and the order had no way to replace him quickly. Every knight in the Levant had been shipped there. Now put both of those men inside one body and give them one rule book. Every food clause the Templars wrote sits exactly on that seam, and the first one already tells you which way the order leaned, because they exempted themselves. The rule states plainly that meat is to be eaten 3 days a week, and it explains that this is a concession, granted because the wasting of the body would otherwise be too great. A Benedictine reading that document in 1129 would have noticed immediately. These monks had written themselves permission to eat like soldiers. People are still making this by hand today. Every one of these dishes is in the medieval larder at the Medieval Way store, medievalway.store, with the 24 recipes that go with them. I will not mention it again. Which makes the rest of the week worth reading twice, because on paper it should not work at all. Keep the scale of the thing in mind while you read it. This was not a handful of men in a chapel. Within a century, the temple held houses and estates across most of Latin Christendom, run from the top by a Grand Master and a chain of provincial commanders, feeding fighting brothers, sergeants, chaplains, and hired hands out of a single written standard. A rule about dinner was a logistic specification applied across 2 continents. The rule lays out the schedule with an accountant's flatness. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, the brothers get 2 or 3 dishes of vegetables or other food eaten with bread. Fridays are Lenten fare, kept meatless out of reverence for the Passion of Christ. The remaining days carry the meat, and Sunday is the substantial one, when the men who ranked highest could take both a midday and an evening meal. Read as a diet, that is roughly 4 days of grain, pulses and vegetables against 3 days that include some meat, week after week, for a lifetime. Beans, lentils and peas boiled soft. Bread as the structural calorie. Cheese and eggs on many of the days that carried no flesh. Fish where fish was available, since fish did not count as meat under the rules the whole church was working from. Those vegetable days were not thin days, which is the detail people get wrong. 2 or 3 dishes with bread in a house that could afford olive oil in the Mediterranean and butter in the north is a substantial meal by the standards of anyone else in the 12th century. A peasant in the same decade would have recognized the ingredients and been startled by the quantity, and startled again by the reliability, because the defining feature of that table was that it appeared every single day, whatever the harvest had done. And there is a clause under all of that which is easy to skim past. The sick and the weak are excused from the whole schedule, and the rule says the infirmary should feed them more and better. That reads as ordinary Christian charity, and it is. It is also the single most militarily useful sentence in the food section. A wounded knight who recovers is worth an enormous amount of money to an order that had to buy him a horse, a hauberk, and years of training. Charity and asset management point the same direction here, and the rule never has to choose between them. Pay attention to how they enforced any of this, though, because that is where the document stops sounding like a menu. The brothers ate in pairs. 2 men to 1 dish, with equal measures of wine in their cups, and the rule is explicit about why. Each was to study the other closely. In a hall of armed men who had come from wildly different families, some of them nobles and some of them not, that arrangement does one obvious thing. It makes it impossible to take more than your share without the man opposite watching you do it. There is a practical dimension too. Bowls and plates cost money, and an order that had taken a vow of poverty was not going to lay out a full setting per man. But the rule does not justify the shared dish on grounds of expense. It justifies it on grounds of observation. And no, that is not a modern historian's reading imposed on the text. The document says it. Consider who was sitting at that table. A recruited Templar knight came from the same class that produced the secular knighthood, which means a hall could contain a younger son of a substantial family and a man from a house with almost nothing, both of them sworn to the same vows, and both of them expected to charge in the same line. Outside the order, everything about a meal announced rank, where you sat, what arrived on your plate, how much wine you were poured, who served you. Inside the order, a single bowl and an equal measure of wine deleted all of it. Not by preaching about humility, which the century did constantly and which changed very little, but by making the arrangement physically incapable of expressing status. 2 men, 1 dish. There is nothing left to display. Now hold the 2 halves of that arrangement together, because the second half is the part almost every article about the Templar diet leaves out. The pairing did not exist only to catch a brother eating too much. It existed to catch a brother eating too little. The rule uses a phrase that translates as secret abstinence, and it treats it as an offence. A man who quietly ate less than his ration, who pushed food across the bowl to his partner, who fasted beyond what the order had set, was breaking the rule as surely as a glutton. Sit with how strange that is by the standards of the century. Everywhere else in the religious world, eating less than required was the most respectable thing a devout man could do. The saints' lives are full of it. Extreme fasting was a route to holiness, a public demonstration of a soul mastering a body, and abbots spent real energy trying to stop enthusiastic young monks from starving themselves into the infirmary. The temple did not treat it as excessive piety. It treated it as a disciplinary problem, and it built the detection system into the seating plan. Think about what that costs a religious order to write down. Fasting was the currency of holiness in that world. An order announcing that its brothers may not fast beyond the schedule is an order publicly ranking something above personal sanctity, in a document it had just carried to a church council for approval. They did it anyway, and the churchmen at Troy signed it. There is a second reason the shared bowl catches under eating that has nothing to do with piety, and it is grimmer. A man who stops eating is often a man who is ill or wounded in a way he has not reported, or losing his nerve. In a house where nobody watches the bowls, the first anybody learns of it is when he cannot mount. In a house where a brother has been assigned to study him at every meal, somebody notices in a week. That is the real reason the food clauses read the way they do. This was not an order trying to make its men holy by making them thin. It was an order that needed a fixed, known, non-negotiable amount of fuel going into every man in the hall, because it had to be able to predict what those men could do in armour 3 months later. A monastery can afford a brother who fasts himself into a shadow. It costs the house a working pair of hands and gains it a reputation for severity, and on balance many houses considered that a fair trade. A fighting order cannot afford it at all. A knight who has spiritually outcompeted his brothers at the dinner table is a knight who falls off his horse at Ascalon and takes the horse, the armour and the men beside him down with him. So the rule set a floor as well as a ceiling. Eat this much, not more, not less. And the man across the bowl is your auditor. Everything else in the food section makes better sense once that is in view. Take the silence. Meals were eaten without conversation while a brother read aloud from scripture, and the rule quotes the psalmist to justify it. Spiritually, the argument is obvious. The meal becomes an act of worship rather than an occasion for gossip or boasting, and in a hall full of young armed men from competitive families, boasting was a genuine hazard. Practically, a silent meal with a reader setting the pace is a meal that starts and ends on a schedule. Nobody lingers. Nobody drinks slowly for 2 hours. The order knew exactly how long its men were at table and exactly when they would be available again. Then there is the almsgiving. 1/10 part of the bread went to the almoner for the poor, and food left over was not to be wasted. That is a religious obligation, and it was also the order's public face. The temple lived on donations from families across Europe, and a house that visibly fed the poor at its gate was a house that kept receiving land, money, and sons. Every one of these clauses is doing at least 2 jobs. That is what makes the rule such an unusual document. It never has to admit that the spiritual reason and the operational reason happen to agree. If that were the only tension in the schedule, the order might have run smoothly on it. There was a harder one. The church calendar and the campaigning calendar collide. The long fast runs through Lent, and Lent falls in the spring, which in the Holy Land is when the armies start moving. The rule builds its heaviest abstinence into exactly the weeks when a mounted force is most likely to be riding out. The order clearly knew. The document is threaded with the language of necessity and dispensation, and later Templar regulations spend a great deal of ink on what happens to the ordinary rules when a brother is on the road, in the field, or in a house too poor to keep the full observance. The commander could relax the schedule. The infirmary overrode it entirely, which is the tell, one more time. When the fasting rules and the fighting requirements came into direct conflict, the fasting rules were the ones that bent. So what was the food section actually for? Not the body, in the sense a modern reader means. Not health. It was a control system. It made every man in the hall eat the same amount as every other man, which removed rank from the one place in the day where rank would otherwise be visible. It removed food as a way to compete in either direction, whether by indulgence or by ostentatious holiness. It set a predictable floor of nutrition under a fighting force whose value was measured in whether a man could still lift a lance at the end of a hot afternoon. And it wrapped all of that in language the 12th century found not just acceptable, but admirable, which is why it survived being written down at all. The sentence about corruption of the body was never a claim about arteries. In the theology those men had absorbed since childhood, rich food inflamed the flesh, and an inflamed flesh pulled a man toward the sins he had sworn off. The corruption in question was moral. That the same sentence followed literally also produced a diet of bread, pulses, vegetables, and a moderate amount of meat is a coincidence of constraints, not a piece of buried science. But it is a real coincidence, and it is worth being precise about what it did and did not produce. A modern dietitian looking at that weekly schedule would recognize most of it. A base of whole grain and legumes, vegetables at the majority of meals, meat present but capped and scheduled rather than daily, fixed portions with no seconds, no grazing between meals because the rule did not permit it, alcohol measured out rather than poured freely. Those are structural features that current dietary guidance keeps arriving back at, and the Templars did arrive there first, by roughly 900 years, for entirely different reasons. What you should not do is stretch that into the claim that circulates online, which is that the Templars lived unusually long lives because of how they ate. The evidence for that is thin. It leans on the ages of a handful of men who reached the top of the order, and reaching the top of the order is by definition something a man does by surviving long enough to be elected. That is a sample selected for longevity before you start counting. Ordinary brothers died of wounds, of disease, and in that climate at rates nobody has reconstructed with any confidence. The honest version is smaller and more interesting. The rule did not make anyone live longer. It made a large number of unrelated men eat identically for decades, which almost nothing else in the medieval world achieved. If you want to take something from that table, take the structure rather than the shopping list. The single bowl is the piece that transfers best, and it costs nothing. Eating with somebody from one dish at a set time with no phone and no second helping waiting on the counter reproduces almost every mechanism the rule was actually using. Portions become visible. The meal has a beginning and an end. It stops being something that happens continuously in the background of a day. The schedule transfers too. The order did not decide each evening what sort of day it was having. Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday were fixed. Friday was fixed, and nobody negotiated with the calendar. Deciding in advance which days carry meat, and then not revisiting the question, is the whole of the Templar method stripped of the theology, and the food itself is genuinely easy to reconstruct, because it was designed to be cooked in quantity by people with other jobs. Dried peas, beans or lentils simmered soft with onions and whatever greens the season gives you, seasoned with salt and herbs, thickened with oats or barley, eaten with a heavy loaf and a piece of hard cheese. On the meat days, a modest amount of it goes into the same pot, rather than onto a separate plate, which is precisely how a kitchen feeding 100 men would have handled it. One caution, stated plainly. This is a history channel and not a doctor, and a rule written for men doing hours of armoured physical work is not a prescription for anybody. Take the shape of it, not the quantities. The Templars were suppressed in the early 14th century, and their rulebook outlived them by centuries in libraries where nobody was reading it for dinner advice. 900 years later, the clause that gets quoted is the one about corruption of the body, and it is quoted almost exactly backwards. The rule was not protecting a heart. It was protecting an army from the two things that could quietly take a man out of the saddle: eating too much and eating too little, in a world that only ever thought to worry about the first one. 2 men, 1 bowl, 3 days of meat, and a brother watching. That was the whole system, and it was never about the food. We dig up the working knowledge history buried. Which rule would you keep, the shared bowl or the fixed days? Subscribe and keep digging. Until next time.